So before we get into discussing the work that these two brilliant filmmakers produced, we'll see some of their clips. I just wanted to start by talking about another element of truth. So truth can be sort of simplistic, right? Like the sky is blue, the earth is round, we're in Tbilisi, Georgia. But beyond those facts, there's a whole emotional architecture that gets built up around the things that we know to be true. Whether those are the things that are personal to us, like in Rena's film, around her family, or the things that a whole society and culture hold dear and hold true, like the Vietnamese community and really the whole world looking at the Vietnamese-American War, right? America's war on Vietnam. And so before we get into talking about what it's like to contest a narrative as these two filmmakers have done, I want to do a little bit of an exercise. So bear with me. This is going to require everybody. It's a little bit woo-woo. So first, if you can just sit comfortably, close your eyes if you feel comfortable. If not, just soften your gaze. And, you know, if you're like me, your brain has been buzzing from all that you've learned and experienced in ZEG. But just take a deep breath and give your brain a moment to arrive. Your body has already entered the space, but just give your mind a second to be here in this space. Now, as you're sitting comfortably, think about some of the things that you know to be true. Maybe they're really personal. Maybe they're political, social. There was just a fabulous panel on gender and pleasure. Maybe you know some truths around that. Maybe you know some truths about your place in your family, your place in the world. Sit with that. Maybe it makes you feel comfortable. Maybe it makes your heart expand a little bit. And now think about times in your life that some of those truths have been disrupted. I know I have some where I learned new truths about my family or my homeland that really made me feel unmoored. In my body, what it feels like is like being on a roller coaster. Maybe you're feeling that. Or maybe your thoughts are just fluttering around with everything that you've experienced. So we'll take one more deep breath as we're thinking and feeling, and then we'll open our eyes, and we'll get into this question of emotional architecture first, because I really think that before you can even tell the beautiful and impactful stories that you told, you had to contend with all of this emotional architecture that was built up. Rena, for you, you started out with this really emotionally laden question, trying to discover more about your father, who you lost at a young age, right? And along the way, you uncovered something, a family secret, that changed the dynamic between you and your mother. No spoilers, you have to watch the film. But tell us a little bit about that, and we're going to watch your trailer.
Hello, everyone. So, I was growing up mainly with my mother. My father had a very sort of elusive, ghostly presence in our life. I literally don't remember seeing his things around the house. I knew I had a father. I first met him when I was 6, but he would come and go. And I remember perhaps a couple of sweaters in the wardrobe, and that was it. He wasn't really part of our household. And for my entire life, my mother was telling me, you know, he's a busy man, he has work. My father was a butterfly hunter, a lepidopterist, and he spent literally an entire season of spring and summer out in the mountains hunting butterflies. He was never, never around in that time. And then in the winter when he was home, he was, I always joke, I say he followed the life cycle of butterflies when they hibernate in the winter and then they are active in summer. And that was my father. He was hibernating in the winter. He spent a lot of time in bed, sleeping, reading. So I don't really remember having conversations with him. I don't remember his presence. So he died when I was 14 years old. And it took me a while. I think I must have been in my mid-20s when I became actively curious about him. I started, when I became myself a storyteller, a journalist, a photographer, I started looking into who he was as a person, not so much as a father, but as a person. And it was about 5 years ago when I decided to embark on this journey to hunt after a rare species of a butterfly that carries his name, a rare endemic species that lives on the border between my country, Azerbaijan, and its neighboring Armenia, two countries that have been at war for 30 years. And the butterfly is only there and nowhere else. And on that journey of, you can say, hunting this elusive species, I got to know my father by talking to people who used to know him, by interviewing my mother, by interrogating my mother about him, about some of the things she's been telling me throughout my entire childhood, which I believed to be true because it was a very good version of a story that I like to believe.
Lovely. So let's watch the trailer.
How does one go about searching for a ghost in a dreamscape of old, unreliable memories? He was here about 60 years ago, and he must have gone up this slope. When people ask me, out of all the people in the world, who would you have liked to meet? I often think I'd like to meet him, because I feel like I've never met him. Расскажите, а сколько у него вообще было жен в итоге?
Ну, это более чем нелепый вопрос. Я от вас такого вопроса не ожидал.
Where the lines are blurred between what's real and what's imaginary. А вы знаете, что я собралась в горы за бабочкой, которая названа его именем? Называется «Сатирус Effendi».
А ты уверена, что ты вообще сможешь ее поймать?
Нет.
Ты знаешь, какой
Я
ареал ее полета?
абсолютно не уверена.
Границы.
Я знаю, что она летает, значит, на границе между Арменией и Азербайджаном в Нахичеване. А вы пойдете со мной туда наверх?
Как ты думаешь? Я даже представляю такой кадр. Мы с тобой присели в такой красивой траве с цветами, и вот с очками. Русташа, видишь наш, Русташа? Я зову моего учителя, Ренаного отца.
Where the story's ending depends on the flight of a whimsical butterfly.
I told Rena when we were discussing this yesterday how much I loved her film, and I was almost getting emotional just talking about it. This is a gorgeous film if you have the chance to see it, and then you can learn what secret she discovers. So Bao, you knew from the outset that your film was going to be disrupting a narrative. Like that was the whole premise. And it wasn't, you know, as close as Rena's, it wasn't her immediate family, but this was something that was impactful to your community in a real, tangible way. So tell us just a little bit about that, and then let's watch your trailer.
Yeah, so I made a film called The Stringer, which is following a team of journalists who are investigating the authorship of the famous Napalm Girl photograph, also known as the Terror of War. And, you know, when I first was approached to do the project, it wasn't about me intending to disrupt the narrative. It was me opening up a new perspective on what was considered the established record or a narrative that had been established for a long time. And oftentimes, I think, as a filmmaker from, you know, the Vietnamese diaspora, I'm always just trying to look at new perspectives. And I've been often sort of shut out of telling a story, usually because they say, oh, you know, you're not part of that community, or, you know, that story has been told before. I mean, the Vietnam War genre is very much a genre on its own, and it's often been told through a white older male perspective, and there have been very few perspectives coming from the Vietnamese diasporic community. I mean, it's very rare that, you know, we have Viet Thanh Nguyen here too. He's probably a cousin of mine, just with the same last name. I mean, there's about 57% of the Vietnamese population have that same last name, actually. But it goes to show that, you know, there is this yearning for more narratives, especially from our generation, because I think for a long time, people of my parents' generation, and you'll see in the trailer, there's many that have had left Vietnam thinking like, you know, believing about the value of survival. Survival is the only value that they cared about because they wanted to survive and they wanted to come and create a new life for their family. And now I think I've been privileged enough where the value is sort of narrative, right? Reclaiming that narrative in many ways. And so I think for me, the intention with this film is to reclaim a narrative that had been so-called established for a long time.
That's excellent. All right, let's watch the trailer for Bao's film.
Some photographs just transcend all others. It's difficult to explain it, but you kind of know it when you see it. The photograph of Kim Phuc is perhaps the most iconic photograph of a war ever made.
It was such a shocking image.
The photographer is almost as well known as the photo itself.
I saw the girl running, then I just get the picture of her.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Ut.
Nick Wood.
When you're photographing with film, there's always some mystery, but what you do know is what you didn't take.
There's a lot more to this story. Nick didn't really take that famous picture. It's time to clear my conscience.
We had our staff photographers and then this army of stringers or freelancers. The front picture was from a stringer. I checked his name.
Can we review what Nick's narrative is?
That's Nick Ut.
He's too far back. You can't get the picture if you're not there.
But what about this guy here?
It matters who pressed the shutter.
A lot of people are going to get spattered by this.
He is the second journalist to agree to an interview and is then backed out.
Not just for one man's legacy.
We shoved it under the carpet. We never talked about it.
Why? But for what it says about who gets remembered
Mình không có bằng chứng gì cả. Mình là zero thôi.
and who gets erased.
Sự thật mà coi thường thì cái xã hội rất là tệ bạc.
He took the picture. It was excluded from reality.
This is the time I'm gonna tell the truth for you. The story of my dad.
Tôi đã giữ sự thật. Ngày hơn 50 năm, tôi là người chụp tấm hình đó. Bây giờ tôi mới có tiếng nói.
Oh, it gives me goosebumps. So I want to talk about a difference between there's many differences between your work, but one of the differences is that Nick, the photographer who was credited with taking this photo, he still maintains, of course, that he did take this photo, but he opted not to participate in this film. So I want to ask a question of both of you because, Rena, you were able to, as you say, interrogate your mother about this narrative. So I want to talk about that difference, both for Rena, what it meant to be able to get your mother to really contend with this, and for Bao, how you dealt with not being able to put those same kind of questions to Nick.
Well, just a disclaimer. I wanted to talk to Nick before I started the film. I know Nick. There's not just casually, not closely, but in the Vietnamese American community, it's very close knit, especially within creatives. And I grew up wanting to be a photojournalist. I just pursued filmmaking instead. So I'm not a journalist necessarily because for me, I didn't study under the same rigor as many people in the room here. But I've always looked up to that achievement of Nick, of a Vietnamese American winning a Pulitzer Prize, winning a World Press Photo Award. And so I immediately reached out to Nick when I was, agreed to do the film. And Gary, who's the sort of lead investigator of the film, I believe reached out to Nick 11 times or so. Gary had been on a panel with Nick, had known Nick as well. And for us, it was important to hear Nick's perspective on this first, because as you said earlier, the story, this film, this allegation would certainly disrupt the community. I mean, because it's we hold that achievement in such high regard in the Vietnamese American community, in the global Vietnamese community, I knew that this would ruffle a lot of feathers, to say the least. And so we wanted to talk to Nick, and we tried many times. And it's up to Nick, if he didn't want to respond. We tried reaching out through close friends, a friend who's making a film with Nick at the moment, or before. And we never heard back from Nick. And for me, the film, though, is called The Stringer, right? It's about this man who had been, or now not denied his voice, but for so long he carried this secret, this story, this memory with him quietly, and he hasn't had the opportunity that Nick has had for the past 50 years to tell that perspective. And so again, for me, not having Nick be interviewed, we still used archival for him to be able to tell his perspective, tell the story of where he was on that day and what happened, and use that to just establish his perspective. And as soon as we did that, I wanted to open it up again to this perspective that hadn't been spoken about for 50 plus years. And that's what we sort of focused on and emphasized.
I just want to underscore one thing, because Bao, earlier when you were talking about your decision to make this film, you talked about the lack of perspective on this conflict from the Vietnamese community, the community impacted, right? And so I think it's really important and also weighty the way in which you wrestled with this, because I mean, there really were these competing things, but ultimately you felt like it was worth it. I wonder if you just have a short thought on why it was worth it to disrupt it.
I mean, I think of my parents generation, who came to America, and they had this past. I was born in the U.S. shortly after they arrived, and I would never hear about what their past lives were. And I did a film about their journey as refugees a few years ago, a short film, and they told me the entire story in the interview. And then I asked them, for 30 years, why didn't you tell me the story? And they're like, well, you never asked, right? And so I think the power of just asking the question of asking, maybe someone else who else was on that road that day? Who else could have taken this photograph? Whose story has been, again, denied for 50 years? Like, that was, a powerful question that I wanted to pursue by making this film.
Yeah. So Rena, you asked your mother and asked, but then the camera changed the dynamic.
So I was growing up inside my mother's version of the story, and her version was that, my father was a busy man who was always at work, and that they had a troubled marriage, and that sort of that in that way she kind of explained his frequent absences. I think it was right sort of a couple of weeks before he died. I was at his studio apartment with my mother, and there was a stack of pictures on the table, and I picked up one of the photographs, and I saw a girl that looked a lot like him, and she was about the same age as me in the picture. And I looked at my mother and my father, and I asked them, who is this girl? And at the time I was 13 years old, approaching 14. And they looked at each other and they said, should we tell her now? And that happened to be my half-sister from my father's other marriage. And that was the first time I learned about her. So they decided right before he passed away, they decided to tell me that I had two half-sisters, in fact, and one was much older and she was somewhere in Russia and I would probably never meet her. And the other one was about my age and she lived across the road from my father's studio with her mom. So all of that information right before he died, at the time it was 91, Soviet Union was falling apart. The war began between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I was a teenager bursting with hormones. And it was just a lot to handle, right? And I kind of, and I sort of made my peace with that scenario. So my mother was, my father's second wife or third wife. I didn't really want to get into the details. And for years I tried to ask my mother, it opened up these cracks in her story. And I would push her, for years I would ask her, so what really happened? Like, when was, who was first? Are you the second? Are you the third? How can you tell me about it? And she would say, it was long ago. I can't remember. I don't remember. And she would shift the dates and just completely change the story. And a big part of me didn't want to prod further. But in the process of this film, I decided this is it. I put on my journalist hat, the hat that you see in the trailer. That's my journalist hat. It's very good. And
it's intimidating.
It's a nice hat, yeah. And I decided, I'm just gonna sit her down and I'm gonna put the camera, just like I've done before, with people. And something magical happens in that moment. Is the camera? It creates this kind of confessional environment where I'm sure you've experienced that as well as a filmmaker, where people sort of they feel responsible. Maybe not to tell you the truth, but to say things to you that they haven't told before to others. I've been in situations where people told me things that they haven't told their own families. They would sit and they would tell me things, they would share and they would cry, and it would be like a very cathartic experience. And they would tell me things that they haven't told their family, like including in the, for the film, I had to travel across the border to Armenia, the country with whom Azerbaijan had a war for 30 years. And I sat down with an Armenian soldier who fought in a recent escalation in Karabakh. And I'm Azeri. I'm supposed to be his, enemy. I'm on the other side, literally on the other side of the front line. And we sat at the cemetery where his friends were buried from the recent war. He lost his comrades. And he told me, I come here every day because I feel like I'm myself here. Around my family, I have to put up a face. I have to pretend I'm happy. Here, I don't have to do that. And he would tell his, not enemy, I don't want to use the word enemy, but the person from the other country, he would say these things. So I sat my mother down, and finally, she told me things that I've always suspected. But she never told me, in the previous years, whenever I asked, she always evaded. And she finally broke, with my KGB interrogation tactics. I managed to get the truth out of her. And I think if it wasn't for the camera and those lights and that moment, this very kind of formal moment of me sitting down, not as a daughter, but as a journalist, interviewing, interrogating my mother, I don't think she would have told me the truth.
And talk a little bit about, you captured that, and talk a little bit about your decision that needed to be part of the public record. Was your mother nervous about that? How did you contend with that as the dual daughter journalist dynamic?
I mean, I felt like it needed to be part of the film. It needed to come out in that way. I felt like in some natural way the film was almost like leading, to that moment. It was very tough. I mean, that interview in the film, it's only 5 minutes, but it actually took 2.5 hours. And she would continue the evasive game. Also, in the beginning of the film, I keep asking her these questions, and she always gives me evasive answers, and they shift. And I decided to include that in the film, that this kind of, I don't want to say lying, but, changing the narrative. And I know that she had her own motivations to do that. I mean, for her, it was for protection, right? She wanted to protect me. And I wanted to show that. I wanted to show that motherly, she's not a villain. She didn't lie because she's, it was for my own good. And I wanted to show that. So it took 2 hours, and I asked my crew, my camera crew, to wear these big headphones to pretend that they're not hearing what she says. So it became quite intimate, yet the camera was rolling, so she felt responsible to say things. But it felt like we were the only 2 people in the room, even though there were 3 more. There were 2 cameramen, and I asked the sound guy to hide in the other room. He left the boom, and he was sitting and controlling the sound in the other room. So there was intimacy there, but there was also this responsibility to say these things.
So we've talked about the institution of the family, or the institution of mom. And
definitely, my mom, you'll know.
So Bao, talk a little bit about, you almost had in a certain sense competing institutions, because Netflix is a huge institution and a major distributor of documentaries, but part of what you were coming up against wasn't just sort of this emotional community history piece, but also the institution of the AP, who had a lot invested here, and also the Pulitzer Board, right? And so talk a little bit about that sort of institutional, what it's like when there's, multiple institutions invested, and you're trying to find a new narrative.
I mean, I think for me, just figuring out once we, spoiler alert, but we find the stringer. I mean, it's in the trailer, but what he wanted and how he wanted to tell his story, right? And in the beginning, before, at the beginning of the investigation, the beginning of the search for the stringer, I think maybe I had some wishful thinking and naivete, believing that, once we found him and once we got more sort of hard evidence, then it's possible that the AP would change the credit. But that's not something that the stringer wanted. He just wanted to tell his story. I think for a long time, institutions have failed him, have failed many people in the community. I mean, I hold the AP to such high regard, and I believe the journalists are doing very great work, but I think when you're investigating an injustice within your own organization, there should be some independent counsel or third-party investigation. But at the end of the day, the stringer Nguyen, his name is Nguyen, he just wanted to speak his truth, and he always knew that, this is AP took his credit, they paid him $20 for it. And so he never had this belief that it would be given back to him. I think what's interesting now is these institutions, I should say, AP, just to give a little context, without spoiling the story, was that AP had made a report prior to our release at Sundance saying that they were certain that Nick was the one who took the photograph, about 17 pages. Gary and the team of journalists tried to engage the AP early on, and they listened at first, but didn't want to open the archive to outsiders. And once the film came out, they came with a longer report, almost 90 pages, where they said that they couldn't be certain whether or not Nick or Nguyen took the photograph now, but without definitive evidence, then they're not going to change the credit. And I think the idea of definitive evidence 50 years later is very difficult to provide. And the type of films that, again, I have this caveat that I'm not a journalist, because in a way I'm searching for the emotional truth of a story, and then I'm observing a team of journalists who are finding the factual truth. But I think many, especially refugees and people of displaced communities, having evidence and archive is very difficult. We flee a country very suddenly. We don't bring all our archive, and even when we had any archive at home, it's not the same that, say, Western countries would have. And so for me, in the way that I kind of operate as a filmmaker, archive is memory instead of archiving. Archive is not necessarily just evidence, it is memory, right? And thinking about that distinction, how do you place someone's memory over someone else's memory? But I do think that we as filmmakers, as storytellers, every story, every memory is deserving of being told.
Yeah. Well, we're at 30 minutes. I have one more question, but I want to turn it over to the audience with the 20 minutes left. But right before I do that, I wonder, Rena, if you can talk a little bit, for how many folks in the room are journalists? Okay, a few. How many of you sort of understand the distinction or difference between somebody who's staff and somebody who's a stringer? Is that, okay. So could you talk a little bit, Rena, about your own experience? Because you've worked in a freelance capacity for different, global brands. Could you just sort of tease that out? Because that's another institutional piece of Bao's film, is this distinction between Nick, who was a staff photographer for the AP, and Nay, who was a stringer.
Well, I think the distinction here also is a journalist on assignment versus a journalist going on spec. For example, I can give you one example here in Georgia. How many of you are Georgian? So,
hey.
Excellent. So in 2008, when, Georgia, when Russia invaded Georgia, I was, for the first day of that war, I was in Baku. I'm from Baku. I was in Baku arranging travel for like a milieu of Western photographers who would say, because there was airspace closed, there was no way to get to Tbilisi. So I was like, okay, you need to get a train ticket from Baku, or if you want a car, I have a driver. So as I'm doing that for a day, I'm just arranging travel. I'm a travel agent all of a sudden for all my colleagues that went on assignment, that came from all over the world, many from New York. I'm sitting and thinking, I'm right here. Why am I arranging travel for all these men?
You're a photographer, not a travel
photographer
agent.
Men coming from New York to Georgia. I should just get up and go. So I called, a magazine that I've been working with before, an American magazine out of New York, and I said, I'm right here. I'm in Baku. We've worked together before. You like my work. I know you said that. Can you send me to Tbilisi? Can I go and report on this war? And the answer was, we already sent 2 staff photographers from New York to cover. And at that point, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to get on a train and I'm just going to go. And I sat on the train, and from the train too, I made a few phone calls asking some editors about. And what they said was like, we have our people on the ground, just send us the pictures you take and we'll see if we publish them. So I went on spec on my own. I had no security, I had no flak jackets, I had no money. The trip to the front line from Tbilisi to Gori, I think was about $300. And you know how close it is. It's like half an hour drive, I think, or 45 minutes drive. So I jumped in, they were kind, my colleagues, they were very kind. They gave me a spot in their car one day. And it was funny, they said, don't go with the wires. The wires, the AP, they always go first. Let's just, wait for the others. Let's see what happens to them, and then, go with the magazines later. So I jumped in the car with AP, and we happened to be the first in the moment when Russian tanks pulled over, to Gori. So I remember standing there, and a few colleagues of mine that came on assignment, I was texting them saying, the Russians are here. I can see them. and they were far back. So yeah, I mean, it was all on spec. It was without any guarantees. And it was a thing that I probably wouldn't do now. I probably would not, at this point in my career, in my life, as a mother, I would not just go to a war without insurance, without assignment. But many people do. There are a lot of freelancers that go out and risk their lives and get hurt and don't even end up covering the costs that they put in in going into the story. I was lucky in the end. I did get published, and a few magazines took bought my pictures. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about selling pictures. I was just thinking, it's next door. It's my home. I consider my Georgia my home away from home. So I'm right there. So I felt I needed to go, and that's what happens.
Thank you for that. What questions do y'all have? I see my friend in the back with glasses, I think, in the middle. Microphone's coming. Maybe.
First, I have a question for Bao. It's about the film that I didn't see, unfortunately.
Not yet. Anyway.
Not yet, but I'm interested to see. So you mentioned that you tried to interview Nick Hutt for 14 times, or like to try to reach him for the film. I have some common friends, and actually I have a slightly different version of it, but I don't know which one is the truth, to be honest, because I was not there and I didn't receive any email. So my question is, did you try to interview David Brunette that actually is in the photo? And he was there when the photo was taken. If he was interviewed for the film, and why, after the film was released for festivals, why it was so difficult to see it? Because later on, the AP staff and Nick wanted to see the film, and apparently it was impossible for a while until it was sold, or maybe it was arranged, but until it went to Netflix. So I have two questions.
Thank you for your question. So, again, the team of journalists who I observed in the film, they did reach out to David Burnett. They spoke to David Burnett, and David did not want to appear in the film. So if you watch the film, we do use archival interviews of David Burnett so we can have his perspective. We wanted to make sure that everyone who was there on that day, who had spoken about their experiences, were shown in the film. And so Gary knows David Burnett very well. They talked, but David did not want to appear in the film. And so the second part of your question was in terms of the release. I think for me, I wanted to take as much care of someone's story, Nguyen's story, who's been waiting 53 years to tell his story. He should have agency of how it's shown, where it's shown. So we worked closely with his family. I think oftentimes when we talk about Nick, we forget the other person who has been denied this chance to tell his story. Nick has many different opportunities. He has told his story for decades, but Nguyen has never told his story. So do we take care of the person who has been denied and carried the secret so quietly for the rest of his life? And for me, that's made my decision easier in terms of how we take care of this story. I think there was arguments of like, oh, why don't you just release this on YouTube and everyone could watch it? Or why wasn't this made into a news piece? I mean, Gary actually wrote an article for Rolling Stone before the release of the film. No one read it. Gary approached different news organizations. No one wanted to pick it up. And so, for me as a filmmaker, I understand the power of film to, again, talk about emotion, talk about legacy in ways that maybe a news piece wouldn't have done Nguyen's story justice. And for me, that was, pinnacle for me, the pinnacle of the reason of why I just, we decided to work with Netflix on it. We made the film independently. We talked to different, platforms and organizations, and I had worked with Netflix before. And, we live in a time where people don't believe journalism has any worth. And now when something has been given a platform where many people can see a piece of journalism, see this film, there is a critique of that for some reason. And I'm not a journalist and I'm not part of that discussion in a way, but I believe that we wanted to elevate the story and the platform that Nguyen, was able to tell his story to the world.
I see in the front and then in the middle here.
Thank you so much. It's been such a privilege to be at this session. I'm really in awe of your work. So, Rena, I have a question for you. How did your relationship with your mother change after making this documentary? I'm really interested in that dynamic. And Bao, I have a question for you, which is you mentioned at the start that the credibility from people from diaspora is often questioned. Has that prejudice collapsed, or is it still there now for you? Thank you so much. So, yeah, start. So, when I started making the film, and after my mother and I had a conversation on camera, she would tell me, so is the film going to come out in Azerbaijan? And I said, yes. She said, can you please make sure it doesn't? I said, no. Then she said, when it did premiere in Baku, she said, can you please not invite any of our relatives? My sister doesn't know. What I told you, my sister doesn't know. Please don't invite them. I said, of course I will not. And I did. I invited every single family member, including her sister. She was in the front row. And she's this 90-year-old frail woman. My mom's my aunt. And after the film ended, she came to me. You be me, I'm the aunt. And she said, Rena, we always knew. And then she called my mother, and she was gushing about the film. She said, it's such an amazing film. You were so amazing in it, and all of that. And my mother then told me that she felt relief. She felt relief that she unburdened that secret that she carried all her life. She felt relief that her sister knew and did not judge her for it, that none of the relatives in our family actually judged her for it, that this whole facade that she's been carrying on for so long, it was all for her own sake, but no one else really, really judged her. So it became a lot softer, the relationship. And recently in Istanbul, we had a premiere. It was like a week ago before I came here. And again, she's like, I'm gonna come and watch the film. It was the first time she'd actually watch it on a big screen. But please don't tell anyone that I'm in the audience. I said, okay. And then, of course, when the Q&A part started, I said, my mother, she's in the audience, and she came on stage and she told things to the audience very open. She cried in the film. She cried. She was touched by it. And then she said things to the audience that she never told me, to an audience of strangers, 100+ people, complete strangers, and she opened up to them. And the next day she said, you made a beautiful, piece of art. I congratulate you. So the power of filmmaking.
I think in some ways it takes something that is perhaps personal and private and sort of elevates the importance in a way that I think could be really healing, perhaps.
I think, yeah, I've noticed it again in my work with other people. There is this kind of therapeutic element, almost like a catharsis when you talk. I don't remember the name of the speaker, but it was Arva Damon. There was a session about pain that we keep in our bodies and how it's important to release things that we hold, that they become almost physical burden on our bodies. And I think that's part of it. I think that's why it becomes really cathartic.
Yeah. Wow.
Just to quickly answer your question, I think certainly it still happens all the time in terms of I don't think it's collapsing. I think it takes conversations like this and recognition that displaced communities, historically marginalized communities, they don't have access to archive in the way that other communities have, and to expect that we have to again use archive purely as evidence is that's the whole reason that people are marginalized and stories aren't told. In this case in point, like the AP had their report, they said that they spoke to everyone that was living on that day. They talked to David Burnett in depth, but they didn't talk to the NBC sound person who you see in the trailer at the very end wearing the white jacket, who is the only other Vietnamese living witness, who was an NBC sound person for 50 years. And they didn't interview him for this 90-page report. So again, it's who do we hold reputation higher? Like, I don't want to judge that this person's memory is more important than someone else's memory. But when you start denying someone the opportunity to even speak their memory and their story, I think it says a lot.
Yeah, just quickly, because I know Sergey had a question in the front, but to that point, you know, with Me Too in American journalism was really forced to think about that question of evidence, because a lot of women, you know, I heard somebody in y'all's session on the first day say, well, why did Nguyen wait so long to speak? And it was so interesting because that's the question that's often asked of women who wait decades to talk about sexual abuse or sexual violence, right? And in some ways, I mean, they're completely different, but in some ways the answer is similar, which is that they didn't feel they would be believed. And so it's interesting the way you're talking about that, because the framework for American journalism for many newsrooms in terms of thinking about evaluating decades-old claims of abuse is no longer do they have a police record because there's an acknowledgement that maybe they didn't go to police, but do they have anything else contemporaneous, which was very much what the journalists did in The Stringer, which was, okay, you don't have the print, you don't have the negative, what other elements of proof do you have? And in some ways, it's very similar, because what he had was he told people contemporaneously, and there was one other person at the AP who said, yes, this is what happened. So I think your point is quite interesting, and to the point about which communities get heard and believed, I do think some of that shifts, but to your point, it's an ongoing process. And I appreciate you saying that these conversations can be important in that regard. Sergey, did you have a question? Sergey.
Yeah, thank you, Emma. It's better and better. I want to thank both of you for the courage to tell these stories. And my initial question to Rena was the one which was just asked, because I'm working with similar issues, similar matters with my family. But now I want to ask you, Rena, again, what was your thought process of the medium of the project? Because obviously I know the photo story, and it's like astonishingly beautiful. So when the idea of making a movie appeared, and how did you combine taking like photos, doing a photo project, and making a movie? So talk about the process, please. Thank you.
So yeah, I'm a photographer in my normal life. So it's a sort of a one-dimensional, you can say, medium. And with this particular story, it started from... Well, it started, again, as I said, in my mid-20s, when I started having these internal dialogues with my father and becoming curious about him. There are so many parallels between the kind of work that he did of butterfly collecting and the kind of work that I did of collecting images and photographs. And even, you know, I work with film, so negatives. And it's the archiving of butterflies. He's collected over 100,000 butterflies in the Caucasus Mountains and pinned them to the board and wrote tiny little labels about the species and the habitat. And I almost compare it to captions and archiving of my own work. So, and it's this whole idea of, hunting, collecting, archiving. So that dialogue started in my mid-20s when I became a photographer. But then I think it was about 2016 or 17 when I one day decided to look up my father's name on the internet and see what comes up, right? So I discovered this Wikipedia page in the Russian language somebody created, and I was reading about him, and then at the bottom of the page I saw this mysterious name, Satyrus Effendi, a butterfly, discovered by his friend, Ukrainian lepidopterist called Yuri Nikrutenko. He was best friend, discovered a new species of a butterfly in the Caucasus and decided to name it after my father and gave it his name, Effendi. And I clicked on that link, and I saw the whole page of where the butterfly flies, and it's only in this war border and nowhere else. And I thought, oh my God, this is how typical, even this butterfly is just like him, you know, very stubborn, flying in this border, inaccessible, no one can go there, you know. So I became really intrigued. But in 2016, my father the way he used to travel, he would get on a bus in Baku, he would cross Azerbaijan, he would cross Nagorno-Karabakh, he would cross the border with Armenia and then go to this weird, we have a very weird geography, weird enclave called Nakhchivan, which is part of Azerbaijan, but it's isolated by Armenia. So I couldn't repeat that journey physically because these lands around Nagorno-Karabakh were still under, you know, Armenian military occupation, so I couldn't actually cross these lands. But in 2020, with the escalation of the war, the Second Karabakh War, they've, you know, retaken the lands and I was able to travel. And that's when the film idea came to be.
Well, I feel like we could continue this conversation, but we are at time. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Bao and Rena. And the conversation will continue beyond.